There have been so many days over the past few years, too many days, when current events have thrown me into despair. None so much as June 24th, 2022, the day the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. That sinking feeling that in some important way the Christian right had won. About a month later, I was at the library and this book caught my eye, The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America by Francis Fitzgerald. I was immediately taken aback by how deeply this topic resonated with the current moment. I couldn't think of a more important book for me to read in these times, so I checked it out and I got to work. I read it like a school project, taking notes and copying down quotes. It was so intense of a project, in fact, that I still haven't finished it yet. But one thing that stuck out in my mind was how the seeds of the Christian right's power and influence were firmly planted during the revivals of the First and Second Great Awakenings in this country. Protestant Christianity swept the nation as preachers traveled from state to state and town to town, fomenting what Fitzgerald describes as a rebellion against the formalism of the established churches and an effort to recover an authentic spiritual experience, a religion of the heart as opposed to the head. Indeed, she goes on to say that many of them explicitly preached individual freedom and separation of church and state, helping to create what she calls a marketplace of religious ideas. Imagine. But it really got me thinking about the possibilities of a liberal religious revival. What would that look like? What would it mean for our country? And most importantly, what can we do to bring about such a spiritual revolution? And let me be clear, when I say liberal religious revival, I'm not just talking about a rise of religious people who vote Democrat or are politically progressive even. I'm talking about liberal religion, free from dogma, built on humility and love and hospitality, drawing from reason and critical engagement as much as from intuition and spirit, with the free and responsible search for truth and meaning at its very core. And this goes way beyond Unitarian Universalism. There are spiritually and theologically liberal elements in all the religions of the world, including Christianity. And it's long past time for us to come out of the woodwork and make our voices heard. Of course, this is already happening to some extent, as we see with things like the Poor People's Campaign, spearheaded by Reverend William Barber II. But it's not nearly enough. One of the biggest obstacles for religious liberals is the deep-seated contempt that a large portion of the political left has for religion in general, based on their experiences with the Christian right. It breaks my heart every time I see a tweet or a Facebook post about some new draconian theocratic law that's just passed, and they say, "This is why I hate religion." I try my best to push back and let them know that the Christian right does not even come close to representing the totality of religion. But it's going to take all of us to show the world that this is not who we are. That means each and every one of us speaking candidly and unabashedly to our family, friends, and neighbors about our faith and the people it calls us to be, and the values and beliefs it calls us to hold dear and true. Speaking earnestly on matters of faith in liberal terms, and speaking prophetically to the moral and ethical issues of our times in religious and spiritual terms. A friend of mine from seminary used to always talk about how he is a Unitarian Universalist evangelist, because as opposed to the Christian movement known as evangelicalism, evangelism at its core really just means spreading the good news. And we should all long to spread the good news of Unitarian Universalism and liberal religion. But the work of starting a liberal religious revival is certainly not only external. There is a great deal of internal work to be done as well. After all, if we are going to spread the good news of liberal religion, there has to be good news to spread, right? I believe that in many ways we need to radically rethink the way we do things. As much as we like to fancy ourselves as a more modern alternative to the stuffy old-time religion with an E at the end of old and a Y instead of an I, there are still a number of ways in which we are just as stuck in the past as many of our contemporaries. All too often, our Sunday worship continues to adhere to a very Protestant tradition, at least in structure, if not in content. That's not always necessarily a bad thing, of course, but I think former UUA President Bill Sinkford said it best when I saw him preach at the 150th anniversary of the First Unitarian Church of Portland, Oregon. He said, "The past is ours to hold, but not to be bound by." That means cultivating a church life that it is vibrant and alive in its worship, governance, outreach, sense of community, and social interaction on down the line. It means engaging with new ways of thinking and being and taking risks that might not always pay off. And I can't stress this enough: meeting people where they are. The deep undercurrent of not just classism, but intellectualism in Unitarian Universalism and in liberal religion as a whole is certainly nothing new. Really, in liberalism in general, if we're being honest. Indeed, as Fitzgerald tells us in her book, in those parts of the country where the established denominations held sway, revivalists inveighed against the wealth and pretensions of the genteel clergy and called them oppressors of the poor. I know we all laughed when a certain then presidential candidate said he loves the poorly educated. And yes, there is, of course, a point to be made about how people like them exploit that lack of education. But there's also an even more salient point to be made, I think, about the disdain and condescension with which liberals treat anyone without a postgraduate degree, let alone a university education. This is often as true in our congregations as it is in society at large, and it is absolutely eroding our ability to make inroads with the very working class people who should and oftentimes do, in fact, agree with us on most things. The poorly educated are not to be mocked, especially when they are so often being intentionally kept in ignorance by the people who need them to submit to their authority in order to continue cultivating and hoarding unconscionable amounts of power. And honestly, sometimes the very academic language we use and standards that we hold people to in the justice work that we do can be highly prohibitive as well. In fact, our standards, in many ways, are highly prohibitive. For example, I know intimately from personal experience how prohibitive the process of becoming a minister in this faith can be. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, of course. It should be hard to become a minister, absolutely. But in Fitzgerald's book, I read so many accounts of people with little education or experience being called from within their congregations to be preachers and ministers simply because the people saw the Spirit of God in them. Of course, I am in no way advocating for going to that extreme. Of course, we need high standards for our ministers. But when those standards become prohibitive, keeping good, capable people out of ministry because they can't afford it, or perhaps even because they are just too deeply human and imperfect to reach our lofty standards, that, to me, becomes a problem. I dream of a Unitarian Universalism where anyone who can make this faith more vibrant and alive can aspire to religious leadership. Or maybe I dream of a Unitarian Universalism and a liberal religious movement as a whole where we redefine religious leadership altogether in a way that is not only more accessible, but opens our communities up to the tools and gifts we need to start a liberal religious revival, namely the passion and inspiration to spread the good news of liberal religion and to realize our shared vision of a new kind of faith, free from dogma, built on love, drawing from reason as much as from spirit, with the free and responsible search for truth and meaning at its heart. May it be so.